Welcome everyone. I'm Councillor Mary-Ann Brown, Chair of Rural Councils Victoria.
Hi, my name's Jane Ogden. I'm a councillor for the Gannawarra Shire Council. I'm the Deputy Mayor there and I'm also the Deputy Chair of Rural Councils Victoria.
We represent Victorian rural communities. Our communities are responsible for 79% of Victoria's landmass and have a population of about 745,000.
Rural Councils Victoria is the peak body representing and advocating for Victoria's rural communities. But rural communities on their own can't do what needs to be done to ensure livable, sustainable and prosperous rural communities, which are fundamental to the ongoing success of Victoria.
We need help and we're calling on the federal government to assist us to make sure our communities are prosperous, livable and sustainable.
We need federal government help to keep rural communities safe, housed, healthy, educated, employed and connected. Today we outline the key asks that rural communities need the next federal government to deliver.
Rural Victoria needs 87,000 new houses over the next 15 years. That translates to 5,800 startups every year. If we fail to deliver on this, that's a loss of productivity of $1 billion. That's why Rural Councils Victoria is calling on the federal government to increase the National Housing Infrastructure Financing Corporation funding to $2 billion and also to establish grants to assist councils to overcome the infrastructure barriers to housing development.
Rural roads are in a shocking state. Despite our small proportion of the state's population, more than half Victoria's road fatalities happen on country roads. With dwindling resources, councils are left to manage 75% of Australia's road network. It is unfair and costs lives. That is why Rural Councils Victoria is calling on the next federal government to increase Roads to Recovery funding to $800 million per annum, to instigate the local roads and community infrastructure program, and to increase the federal bridges renewal program.
What about the older people in our communities? Rural Victoria has a higher proportion of older people in our communities, and much of the rural infrastructure for aged care is no longer fit for purpose. So what are we going to do about it? Demand for rural home care packages is expected to double within the next decade. That's why Rural Councils Victoria is calling on the next federal government to reform pricing of the Commonwealth home care packages, introduce a rural building program for older rural Victorians, and to create a capital matching scheme for the construction of aged care facilities.
Massive fires and floods have demonstrated that adequate emergency management funding for natural disasters and climate events is essential for rural communities. Rising temperatures and increasing and more intensive extreme weather events, including floods, storms, heat waves and bushfires, will increase pressure on rural volunteer firefighters, vulnerable community members, and even have detrimental impacts on agriculture and tourism. That is why Rural Councils Victoria is calling on the next federal government to provide greater funding for councils to prepare staff, communities and facilities for emergencies, to ensure greater grant funding for mitigation and preparation activities for councils from the National Recovery and Resilience Agency, and to commit to mitigation, climate change resilience and natural disaster risk reduction measures. Tourism is the economic lifeblood of rural Victoria. Rural communities are still recovering from the disastrous January 2020 bushfire season and the COVID-19 emergency. Tourism jobs are down almost 7%, and the plunge in rural and regional tourism's share of gross regional product is more than 21%. That is why Rural Councils Victoria is calling on the next federal government to provide grants for tourism-related infrastructure upgrades, sponsorship and support for rural events, and upgrades to public facilities at tourism spots, and to create a domestic tourism campaign targeting rural Victoria's tourism hotspots funded by Tourism Australia.
Rural councils play a critical role in supporting rural communities. However, rate revenue continues to be low and is capped, and the pressure on council services and infrastructure continues to grow. And the exodus from the cities, which has been caused by COVID, has exacerbated that situation while providing great opportunities for our community. That's why Rural Councils Victoria is calling on the next federal government to extend the local roads and community infrastructure program, and also to increase the financial assistance grants to rural councils.
Despite NBN saying its infrastructure build is complete, the reality for too many rural Victorians is no broadband access, or a service that is unstable or so slow that the benefits of digital connectivity are very limited. Improving broadband and mobile coverage in rural Victoria is essential to strengthening the social and economic well-being of rural Victorian communities. It is essential for business, education, health and jobs. That is why Rural Councils Victoria is calling on the next federal government to provide fixed-line broadband access to all towns with a minimum of 300 premises, and to eliminate mobile black spots in rural Victoria.
What can you do? When talking to your federal MP or candidate, ask them to step up and do more for rural Victoria. Tell them rural Victoria needs 5,800 new homes a year for the next 15 years.
We need road funding increases.
We need more aged care places.
We need greater funding for emergency services in the face of increases in intensity and frequency of floods, heat waves, storms and bushfires.
We need a campaign to support the tens of thousands of tourism jobs in rural Victoria.
We need better support for rural councils so they can deliver for rural communities.
We need fixed line broadband access for all towns with over 300 premises.
And the elimination of mobile black spots.
Please contact your federal representative or candidate. Let them know these issues are important to you.
It is critical for the survival and prosperity of our rural councils. You can find the contact details for your senators and members using the link below. But we urge you to take advantage of this opportunity. To make rural Victoria better for everyone. To make rural Victoria better for everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for that conversation today. We now have some questions. Well, we're going to answer some questions that you may have. So I'd like to invite our guests to the stage. My name's Warwick Mary. I'm going to be the host of the conversation. And with me, of course, is Councillor Mary Ann Brown, who is the Chair of Rural Councils Victoria. Also, Councillor Jane Ogden, who's the Vice Chair of Rural Councils Victoria. And Andrew Mason, who is the Treasurer of Rural Council Victoria and also Committee Member. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I would remind anyone who's watching, and we do have quite a few people watching, please put your comments or questions in the chat on YouTube, and we will bring those questions over here to the main area. But I want to start by saying that COVID-19 has affected everywhere, and rural communities, it's had a different kind of impact. Marianne, I might start with you. What's been the impact of everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people moving to rural areas? What's been the impact of that on the services and finances of our rural councils?
So first of all, Warwick, it's an opportunity for our communities because many of them have been wanting to attract more people to fill job vacancies that they have. And what we are seeing at the moment is that unemployment is at record lows. Now, in many of our communities, that was the case prior to COVID. And so there are certainly jobs available, but it's put significant pressure on housing. Again, many of our communities were already experiencing shortages, both in terms of short-term rental and housing for sale prior to COVID, and it's exacerbated those pressures. And I guess the other thing, it's really identified or highlighted the critical importance of digital connectivity, because people have been working from home, they've been doing homeschooling, they've been accessing health services, they've been trying to run their businesses. And so that digital connection is absolutely critical, and it's really brought that to the fore. It's no longer a luxury, it really is an essential service that all communities should have access to a certain standard. So I think there's lots of opportunities, but it has also created pressures in our communities as well.
It's interesting you talk about the digital connectivity. Jane and I were in the technical setup before this. She's like, you're frozen, purely because her connection is so bad. And this day and age, we do so much online. But there's other things that are pretty bad in terms of, Jane, how are the roads? Talk to me about roads. We just saw, and I say this because I'm the son of dairy farmers and living in the country. The roads have always been bad. Are they getting worse?
Well, yes, they are. There's as rural councils certainly don't have a lot of money for roads. We do the best we can, but we've also got we've got huge kilometres of roads compared to what city councils have, and we have a small rate base. So we just, and our rates are capped. So we really need more support from federal and state government for our roads, because they really are. And we also have the highest death rate in the rural on rural roads. So we need to really get support for that.
Questions come through from Cami. Where we talk about the Victorian rural councils need to manage 75% of the roads. What role does Vic Roads play in this? Like, a lot of us are paying, when petrol prices and diesel prices are at an all-time high, we're paying a big fuel excise. What role do Vic Roads have to play on the roads?
Well, Vic Roads look after the main roads. I don't know. I might go to Andrew. Andrew, do you know more about what it is? The main highways and main roads, but not the littler ones.
So, Warwick, I think it's a great question, because I think in local government you often get criticised for the condition of the roads, and quite often when you then drill into it and say, well, what road are you talking about? In a lot of cases, it's the arterial road network, and I think that Rural Councils Victoria has been asking for a long time for the arterial roads to be improved. They're often the roads that carry the significant volumes of traffic, the roads that people go on daily. So I think for Rural Councils Victoria, we're asking both state and federal government both for funding for the local road network, as well as improvements to the arterial road network.
Well, Mary, can I just make a comment there? The other thing is that the road network, both from the farm gate to port, is made up of various components, and our communities are still very reliant on that network, as opposed to rail freight, to get goods to market, amongst other things. So, it is a network, and I agree with Andrew's point, but it is still the most significant and most heavily used way that people get around, whether it's to do business, go to work, go to school, access health services, by and large, partly because there's in many areas there's very poor or non-existent public transport services. The rail freight network in parts is not well maintained. So the road network is absolutely critical for many aspects of life in our communities.
And might I just also add quickly that the economic impact for things to do with mining. We've got mineral sands up in our area and rare earth, and that's going to be supporting mobile phones and batteries, and we want to be able to get that, to the right place, but we're on terrible roads.
One of the other things that I think it's going to support also is tourism. Now, it's interesting in the conversations, Marianne, that you and I have been having. You've said that after agriculture, rural tourism is basically one of the biggest income generators for rural areas. So what sort of support do you need? Like, how do we make the rural tourism more popular, more easily accessible, more enticing? What do you need?
Well, I think first of all, we need investment in infrastructure. So whether it's a tourism project itself, because we've got some great natural assets in rural Victoria, but we need investment so that people can access those assets in a sustainable way. So that's one aspect. And I think the other thing is about getting the story out there. And that's why we're talking about a domestic tourism a marketing campaign by Tourism Australia so that people are aware of what is basically in their own backyard. Now, we have seen some of that during COVID, particularly in Victoria, because people couldn't travel outside the state. So, I've been a volunteer at the Dunkeld Visitor Information Centre for 25 plus years and have had people who come in and said, this is the first time I've been to Dunkeld or this part of the Grampians, and they live in Victoria. So, and that's has been quite a common story. So again, there's great opportunities, but we need investment. We also need to look at the whole issue about employment, because there have been lots of jobs lost in that sector. They're trying to rebuild, but it's very difficult to attract staff.
Talking to some of my friends who run tourism businesses down to rural areas like Aireys Inlet and other places, they're talking about, due to lack of housing, they can't get staff because there's not enough affordable housing there. So you talked about needing 87,000 new homes. Where does that number come from?
So last year, Rural Councils Victoria commissioned a housing blueprint, and SGS Economics did that piece of work, and they've identified that's the demand over the next 15 years, which equates to 5,800 new starts every year. And if you spread that, say, across 35, 38 councils, we're talking about a few hundred starts at least, which is not happening. I mean, Andrew can probably talk about the Great Ocean Road, which is in his part of the world, and what's happened there with tourism, and some stories about where staff are living, which are pretty horrendous, to be quite frank.
So that's right. I think housing has become the huge issue following the pandemic. It was probably an issue that wasn't particularly we had good in rural Victoria, generally had good affordability for both purchase and rental, and that's vanished. And that's a product of housing being soaked up and taken up by people escaping, and understandably escaping Metro Melbourne. But then it's also putting tremendous pressure on rural communities and ability to be able to attract workforce. And so, in my case, we've had senior executives in local government having to rent and stay in caravan parks for 6 months because there's no housing available. So it's gone. It's a tremendous issue. It is fixable, and so but it needs some changes to the planning system, some streamlining of rezoning, and then some. We say some dollars for infrastructure to help get some of that housing on the market, or land available, and then allowing housing to be built on it. So, I think it's a huge issue for the sector, for the regions.
There's a couple of comments coming through that I just wanted to share with everyone. James Nolan's talking about how don't forget about towns with less than 300 premises when it comes to fixed wired connectivity. And I think, as you were saying, being connected to the internet is so important to us now to run our businesses. Farms have become so high tech, and because there is so much more than just farms in rural Victoria, there are so many great businesses and manufacturers, it's really important to stay connected. Siobhan's talking about how well connected Murrindindi is, looking at that intersection with livability, tourism, houses, jobs, labour. There is so much there. And I think, as we've just talked today, You've got to have the roads to be able to get the product, service, people in and out. You've got to have the connectivity to the internet so that people can enjoy what they're doing and find out what else is in this town. Recently, I was in Rutherglen and like, okay, what cafe are we going to? Where are we staying tomorrow night? You need that internet connectivity. Black spots are just so painful. That you need the housing for the staff, and not just staff, but all these people who are moving there. So talk to me a bit about aged care, because it's not just young people going, let's bring up our kids in the country. There is that young people. So Jane, from your experience, why is aged care investment so important to rural Victoria?
Well, we have a lot more aged people in our rural areas. Basically, we have an ageing population, and there's expected to be a surge of 130% by 2031. And 34% of our rural population will be aged 60 and over by 2036. So, and compared with 21% in Melbourne, for example. So we're really needing such great support for aged care and for home care. And, you know, rural councils don't have a huge rate base, and we need support in this area. As our aged, they really need looking after, and they've done a lot of work. They've worked for many years and paid their taxes, and we want to support them.
And Warwick, I think the other thing is that you're not likely in many of our communities to see, larger investors investing in aged care accommodation. I mean, people, if they can, want to stay in their communities, age in their communities. So it's about supporting them. So it's whether it's about the Commonwealth support packages, about building appropriate accommodation, which might be on a smaller scale than you might see, say, in a metropolitan area. And again, it's difficult to attract that type of investment, probably because of the scale. But again, as Jane's pointed out, rural areas have a much higher proportion of older residents, and that trend is going to continue. So we need to be able to provide appropriate accommodation and also support, so those people are able to stay in their communities for as long as they wish.
And that brings me to probably the final topic that I wanted to talk about. Again, last chance for anyone who's watching us on YouTube. Please put any questions that you may have in the chat stream, and I'll happily incorporate those into the conversation. And Marianne, maybe this is with you again. Now that we're having more people, more elderly, more tourists that we want to come into our rural Victoria, what role does emergency services have? Because, with climate change, you only got to look around to look at the number of fires, floods, storms. There is so many more incidents happening. So what role do councils have in emergencies, and what support do they need?
Well, first of all, Warwick, councils are closest to their community and really often will be amongst the first to respond to emergencies. I will pass to Andrew in a minute, because in his area they were quite severely impacted by the St Patrick's Day fires. But I think it's also about ensuring that councils have got the capacity to support their communities. The other area where I don't think we are doing enough is looking at mitigation, building resilience, and there's a whole range of strategies there, because Warwick, as you've indicated, many of those events do have serious impacts on our communities, probably disproportionately in terms of population than perhaps in some of the metropolitan areas. So we really need to see a real amping up of support, both for councils but also in terms of looking at mitigation, so we can try and at least reduce the damage that occurs, or perhaps even potentially eliminate it. And my personal view is we are not doing enough in the mitigation space, and there's a whole range of things that local government can do, but also state and federal government can do in that space, so that our communities are not being harmed by these events. Yeah. Andrew, you might want to just talk about St Patrick Day fires and the experience in your area.
Yeah, so that's right. Unfortunately, Craigavite's had a number of different emergencies, including the St Patrick's Day fires. And I think communities look to their council as a sort of a trusted source of information, a trusted source of support. So certainly that was our experience. I I guess one of the issues that we're all grappling with is that it's becoming an area of work that has not necessarily been traditionally core business. It's not necessarily been funded. And so just being able to meet community and state government expectations is going to be, I think, a challenge for rural councils unless it's a funded activity by the state. And I agree, Marianne, with your comments about mitigation. It doesn't make sense to be putting back infrastructure to the same standard that was recently flooded or burnt out. We should be building back better and making sure that infrastructure and that rebuild is better and more resilient to future events. It just it should make sense, but unfortunately, it's often much harder to do that than it should be.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here today for the launch of the Rural Council Victoria's federal platform for 2022. Again, we ask that you consider what issues are important to you and make sure your voice is heard. I'm just putting something in the chat box there which has a list of our asks in terms of what we are asking for the federal government, and it has some of the different details that we're after. And so in terms of making it easier for you to get in contact with your federal member and or senator, I'm also putting a shortcut link to the access page for Australian Parliament House so you can find out their contact details. Please get in touch with them. Let them know this is an opportunity that only comes once every 4 years. We strongly encourage you to reach out to them and let them know that this is truly important to you. Marianne, as the chair of Rural Council Victoria, is there any final closing words you'd like to make?
Look, probably one thing I would like to say, Warwick, is that it's really important that we invest in regional and rural communities. And this is not a problem that's owned by regional and rural communities. This is about contributing and maximising the potential for all Australians. And so it's, digital connectivity, okay, that's a problem for your community, but the ramifications of that in terms of the ability for people to participate in our society and economy are significant. So I think it's really important to emphasise that strongly, because ultimately, and people have heard me say this, these are the places where food is grown, water is stored, power is generated, a whole range of activities occur that are absolutely critical to how we live and how we work. So these are really important investments that we are making that are going to benefit all of us. So it's absolutely important, critical that you bang on the doors of candidates and the sitting members so that they think about these things when they're making promises, but also when they are going to be developing policies. Thank you.
Well,
thank you so much. So a big thank you to Rural Council Victoria Chair Councillor Marianne Brown, also the Vice Chair Councillor Jane Ogden, and the RCV Treasurer Andrew Mason. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you also to everyone who's joined us on the live stream and those who are watching on the recording. All right, we wish you all the very best. Thank you for being here.